Hey guys, tonight we are going on a little journey back in time, a long way back to a place that sounds almost like a dream, or maybe a slightly damp miracle. The vast, bustling capital city of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. Picture this, it's the early 16th century, just before everything changes forever. You're standing on a causeway, a massive stone road stretching out across a shimmering lake, leading you toward a city that seems to rise right out of the water itself. Pyramids soar into the sky, market sounds hum in the distance. And everywhere you look, there are people. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands living, working and thriving on an island in the middle of a lake. It's incredible, it's vibrant, and honestly, trying to feed all those people in that location without modern logistics was an absolutely monumental task. You probably wouldn't survive a week trying to figure out where your next meal was coming from in that environment without some serious local knowledge. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you've arrived at Tenochtitlan. Feel the solid stone beneath your feet on the causeway, maybe a faint mist rising from the lake surface. Hear the distant low murmur of a city that dwarfs anything you've ever imagined for its time and place. This wasn't some sleepy little town. This was a metropolis, a true heart of an empire. And its location utterly stunning, utterly unique, and utterly problematic from a purely practical standpoint. It sat smack dab in the middle of Lake Texcoco, part of a complex system of lakes in the Valley of Mexico. Beautiful, yes. Defensible, certainly. Logistically, challenging to say the least. Imagine trying to build and sustain a massive city. We're talking a population that historians still argue whether it was closer to 100,000 or well over 200,000 people by its peak, which would make it one of the largest cities anywhere in the world at that time, certainly bigger than most European capitals, all on an island with limited natural land. Think about your own city or town. Most of it spreads out across miles of solid ground, right? There are fields nearby, or at least highways connecting you to farmland further out. Tenochtitlan didn't have that luxury. Its initial footprint was small, a relatively modest island. As the city grew pulled by the magnetic force of power, wealth, and religious significance, it swallowed up every available inch of dry land. Temples rose, palaces sprawled, houses crowded together, and markets bustled with goods brought from across the empire. Where in this increasingly packed island paradise were you going to grow the corn, the beans, the squash, the staples that kept this incredible engine of a civilization running? It's like trying to feed the population of, say, Seattle. But if Seattle was just Bainbridge Island, and the only way to get food in was by canoe across Puget Sound. Except maybe even harder. The city wasn't just on an island, it was expanding. Rapidly. People were flocking here, drawn by opportunity, by the sheer energy of the place. Every new family, every new artisan, every new warrior added another mouth to feed. And traditional farming requires land. Land that just wasn't abundant on the island itself. You could bring food in from the surrounding lake shores and valleys, of course. And they did. The causeways weren't just for people. They were highways for tribute, for trade, for bringing in supplies. Vast amounts of maize beans, chili peppers, amaranth, and more poured into the city from the conquered territories and allied states. You'd see canoes piled high with produce, sleek and efficient, gliding across the water towards the city's docks. It was an impressive system, a testament to Aztec logistical power. But relying solely on tribute and trade for the food needs of hundreds of thousands of people is risky. What if a harvest failed elsewhere? What if political instability disrupted the flow of goods? What if a rival decided to blockade the causeways? For a city so powerful, so central, dependence on external food sources was a vulnerability. They needed a way to generate food within the city's immediate sphere of influence, close to home, reliable and scalable as the population continued its impressive, slightly terrifying growth spurt. Imagine being an Aztec city planner, or maybe just a regular person watching the city swell. You see the temples getting taller, the emperor's palace more elaborate, the markets more crowded than ever. You hear the constant construction, The shouts of merchants, the chatter of 100 different languages spoken by people from all corners of the empire. And maybe you feel a little knot of worry. Where is all this food coming from? Are we sure we can always get enough? The city is a marvel, a diamond in the lake, but diamonds don't grow corn. The Aztecs, or more accurately, the people living in the Valley of Mexico, long before the Aztecs rose to absolute power, had already begun experimenting with ways to wrestle productivity from the very environment that seemed to restrict them, the lake itself. There's a mainstream historical fact for you. While the Aztecs perfected and massively expanded the system, they didn't invent floating gardens entirely from scratch. Evidence suggests earlier cultures in the valley were experimenting with similar techniques. The Aztecs were brilliant engineers and administrators, and they saw the potential in these early ideas, taking them to an unprecedented scale to meet the needs of their monstrously large capital. It's a quirky tidbit, but unlike European cities that often grew near rivers or coasts for trade, but relied on the surrounding land for food, Tenochtitlan's very foundation was intimately tied to the water. Their greatest challenge, feeding everyone, had to be solved using the water. Not despite it, it turned their biggest geographic constraint into their greatest agricultural asset. It's like being stuck in a swimming pool and deciding to become the world champion synchronized swimmer. You work with what you've got. So the problem was clear, huge growing population, limited natural land dependence on potentially vulnerable external food supplies. The solution, if one existed, had to be found in the expansive, shallow waters surrounding the island city. It had to be a way to create new land, productive land out of the lake itself. A way to turn the water into fertile soil and the lake into a farm. It sounds a bit fantastical, doesn't it? Like something out of a myth. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. And the necessity facing Tenochtitlan was the most fundamental one of all survival, fueled by enough calories to keep an empire on the move. The stage was set for one of the most ingenious agricultural solutions the world has ever seen, born directly from the unique watery challenge of living on a lake. So you've got this incredible, rapidly expanding city perched on a damp island, and you've got this pressing question: how on earth do you feed everyone? You can't just wish more land into existence, right? Or can you? This is where the true genius, and frankly, the sheer back-breaking effort of the people of the Valley of Mexico comes into play. They looked at the problem, too much water, not enough land, and decided, fine, we'll make our own land out of the water and mud, lots and lots of mud. This brings us to the Chinampas. Now, the word itself might sound a bit exotic, maybe even a little cute, Chinampa. But these weren't decorative flower beds. They were the agricultural powerhouses that sustained the heart of an empire. Imagine floating rectangles of incredibly fertile soil crisscrossed by canals looking from above, like a vast green checkerboard laid out on the surface of the lake. That's a chinampa field. And building one, that was a process that required patience, specific knowledge, and a whole lot of muscle. You wouldn't just wade out into the lake and start piling dirt. Well, you could, I suppose, but it wouldn't work very well. The lake bed mud is soft. The water would just wash everything away. No, you needed a structure, a framework. Think of it like building a giant submerged basket, then filling it. The first step was picking your spot. You'd look for areas of relatively shallow water, not too deep to work in, but not so shallow that they were just mudflats already. These were typically areas around the edges of the main island, or extending out from smaller natural islands nearby. Then you'd mark out a rectangular area. These weren't postage stamps. They could be quite large, often around 30 feet wide and stretching up to 300 feet long. Picture a long, skinny football field floating. To define the edges and create the structure, you'd use stakes and wattles. You'd drive sturdy wooden stakes, often made from the incredibly useful cypress tree, which they called ahuejote, into the lake bed along the planned perimeter of your rectangle. These stakes weren't just structural. Many would sprout and grow into trees, eventually helping to anchor the chinampa even more securely and providing shade. Between these stakes, you would weave reeds, branches, and other organic plant material. This created a kind of permeable fence, a lattice wall, just below or at the water's surface. It's like making a giant horizontal wicker basket. This fence wouldn't hold back water completely, but it would hold back the material you were about to pile inside. It was the retaining wall, the basic skeleton of your new island. Building this framework alone was a significant task. You'd be working in the water, wrestling with branches, driving stakes into the soft lake bed. Not exactly a relaxing Sunday afternoon project. Once the frame was ready, the real work began filling it. And what did they fill it with? Primarily muck from the lake bottom. This wasn't just any mud. Lake Texcoco, especially near a large city like Tenochtitlan, was rich in organic matter. Decaying plants, fish waste, even human waste channeled from the city. Yep, that's a quirky tidbit for you. They were essentially recycling nutrients on an industrial scale long before we thought of composting. This black, silty mud was incredibly fertile, packed with nutrients. You'd scoop this rich muck from the bottom of the surrounding lake bed or the canals they were simultaneously digging to define the Chinampa boundaries. You'd do this using long poles with baskets or nets attached, a kind of manual dredge. Imagine the smell. Rich, earthy, probably a little bit swampy, maybe a hint of decomposition. This wasn't sterile potting mix. This was raw, potent, nutrient-dense natural compost. Scoop after scoop, basket after basket, you would lift this heavy dripping material and pile it onto the reed framework within your marked rectangle. Layer upon layer, the mud would build up. The water would drain away slowly through the woven reed walls, leaving the solid material behind. As you added more muck, the level of your artificial island would rise. It wasn't like building a sandcastle. This was heavier, wetter, and had to be built up steadily. You'd keep piling the muck until the surface was high enough to be above the water level, creating a level rectangular platform of rich black soil. This process of dredging mud from the canals and piling it onto the Chinampa served two purposes simultaneously. It built the garden beds, and it deepened and maintained the network of canals around them. These canals were essential. They allowed canoes to navigate between the Chinampas, transporting materials, plants, and produce. They provided easy access to water for irrigation, though the capillary action of the lake water, rising through the porous mud, also helped keep the soil moist. And they were the source of the precious, nutrient-rich muck needed to continually replenish the soil on the Chinampas, which would otherwise be depleted by intensive farming. It was a closed-loop system, remarkably sustainable. So you had your basic structure stakes driven in reeds woven between them and a big pile of incredibly fertile lake mud on top. The sides, especially with the cypress stakes planted along the edges, would eventually become stable. The stakes would root, creating a living barrier that held the soil in place. This is where historians still argue whether Chinampas were truly floating or whether they were anchored firmly to the shallow lake bed and built up over time, essentially becoming artificial islands rather than rafts. The reality is likely a bit of both, depending on the location and age of the Chinampa. But the image of gardens floating on the water captures the essence of their ingenious design. They certainly felt like islands surrounded by water and accessed by boat. Building just one of these was a significant undertaking, requiring coordination effort and a good understanding of the lake environment. But the Aztecs and their predecessors didn't build just one. They built thousands. Acre after acre, mile after mile, the shallow areas of Lake Texcoco near Tenochtitlan were systematically transformed into a vast grid-like agricultural landscape. It was an engineering feat on a scale that is hard to fully appreciate today. Imagine the sheer volume of mud moved the number of stakes cut and driven, the hours of labor spent knee-deep in the water. This massive transformation resulted in incredibly fertile and productive land. A mainstream historical fact here: Chinampas were significantly more productive than traditional rain-fed farming techniques used in other parts of the empire. Because they had constant access to water and were continually refertilized with nutrient-rich mud, they could support multiple harvests per year, sometimes up to 7 or 8 crops from the same piece of land in a single year. Compare that to 1 or maybe 2 harvests from a typical field elsewhere. This wasn't just supplementing their food supply. This was a food factory, churning out calories to feed a hungry metropolis. It turned a geographical constraint into a major advantage, allowing Tenochtitlan to support a population density that would have been impossible otherwise. And the process wasn't a one-time build. Chinampas required constant maintenance. Canals needed dredging, edges needed reinforcing, and the soil, despite its initial richness, needed replenishment. So the cycle of scooping mud and piling it on the beds was ongoing. It was a dynamic landscape constantly being shaped and maintained by human hands. The muddy work you did today wasn't just for this season's crops. It was an investment in the productivity of the Chinampa for years, even generations to come. It was a system built on understanding and working with the lake, leveraging its resources, the water, the mud, the reeds, to create something entirely new and life-sustaining. This was farming, but not as most of the world knew it. This was engineering ecosystems with patience and mud. So you've got this incredible, rich, dark soil piled high enough to sit above the water level, contained by those woven reed and stake walls that are probably already starting to sprout into leafy green oejote trees. You've built your foundation, your artificial island of fertility. Now comes the fun part, the part where all that mudslinging and stake driving pays off. It's time to plant. You're standing on the edge of your new Chinampa. The surface is level, moist, and looks incredibly promising. It's not just dirt, it's concentrated goodness, brimming with organic matter. You can almost feel the nutrients humming just beneath the surface. And this is where the real magic, the constant, tireless productivity of the Chinampas begins. Unlike farming on mainland fields where you wait for the rainy season and hope for the best here on the lake, you control the conditions to a remarkable degree. Water is always available literally right there in the canal surrounding you. And the soil, it's the best you could ever hope for, constantly replenished. What are you going to plant in this agricultural paradise? Well, pretty much everything you need to feed a hungry city, and then some. The main staples, of course, are the Mesoamerican trinity, maize, corn beans, and squash. You'd see rows and rows of these. The maize growing tall, providing stalks for the beans to climb, and the squash spreading out along the ground, its large leaves shading the soil and keeping down weeds. It's a classic, efficient polyculture, maximizing the use of space and nutrients. But you weren't limited to just these. You'd also find chilies of various types, tomatoes, though probably smaller and wilder varieties than you're used to, amaranth chia, various leafy greens, and even beautiful flowers like marigolds, which weren't just for show. They were vital for religious ceremonies and decorations throughout the city. But here's one of the truly clever bits, the technique that allowed for those multiple harvests we talked about. You wouldn't just wait for the right season and plant seeds directly into the Chinampa soil and hope they germinate. No, that would be far too inefficient for this premium real estate. Instead, they used a system of seed beds called almacigos. Think of these as little nurseries. They were small protected areas, sometimes on the edge of the Chinampa itself, sometimes back on slightly drier land where seeds would be sown densely. Imagine carefully preparing a small patch of that rich mud, perhaps adding a bit of finer soil to give delicate seeds a good start. You'd plant your maize kernels, your bean seeds, your squash seeds, your chili seeds all close together. You'd tend these little beds, meticulously watering them, protecting the tiny sprouts from birds who knew ancient birds like snacking on seedlings too. Some things never change. This gave the plants a head start. They could germinate and grow into sturdy young seedlings already several inches tall and with a good root system, while the main Chinampa bed was still producing its previous crop. Then as one crop on the main Chinampa bed neared the end of its cycle, say the maize was maturing or the squash was being harvested, you'd prepare to transplant the seedlings from the almacigos. This was the key to continuous production. The moment one crop was out, the next was ready to go. You didn't lose weeks waiting for seeds to sprout and establish themselves. It was like a conveyor belt of greenery. Transplanting wasn't a gentle affair like moving a houseplant. You'd carefully dig up the seedlings from the dense seed bed, trying not to damage the roots too much. Then you'd carry them over to the main Chinampa bed, which had perhaps just been cleared of the last harvest and maybe given a quick top-up of fresh muck from the canal. Using a digging stick or similar simple tool, you'd make holes in the soft soil and carefully place the seedlings in firming the earth around them. Imagine the rhythm of this work. Clearing spent plants, perhaps adding a layer of fresh dark mud, making holes bending to place the young plants moving row by row across the rectangular bed. It was methodical, repetitive work, back-breaking probably, but done with purpose and skill. You'd be surrounded by water, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and growing things. Maybe you'd hear the splash of a fish in the canal, the calls of birds, the ones you weren't trying to keep off your seedlings, the quiet chatter of other farmers working nearby. Because you were starting with established seedlings, they would take off quickly. They had a head start, a strong root system, and were immediately placed into soil that was ridiculously fertile and constantly moist. This drastically shortened the time between harvests. You weren't waiting for seeds to germinate in the open field. You were planting vigorous young plants. This technique, combined with the ideal conditions of the Chinampa environment, allowed for that astonishing productivity. Multiple harvests per year, sometimes 4 or 5 or even more for fast-growing crops like chilies or certain leafy greens. It wasn't quite 8 harvests as mentioned earlier. Perhaps that was a slight exaggeration in some accounts, but certainly far, far more than traditional farming. Let's dial that back a bit. 4 to 6 major cycles per year is a more widely accepted figure, still wildly impressive. Water management was relatively simple once the Chinampa was built. The capillary action we mentioned earlier was crucial. The water level in the surrounding canals was close enough to the surface of the Chinampa bed that moisture would be drawn up through the porous soil, keeping the roots of the plants constantly hydrated. It was like a giant self-watering planter. You didn't need complex irrigation systems. The lake itself did much of the work. Though during particularly dry spells, which were less common in the lakebed area but could happen, or for very young seedlings, you might still scoop water from the canal with a pot or gourd and give individual plants a drink. Pest and disease management on the Chinampas is something historians still argue whether they had specific widespread techniques or relied more on the vigor of the plants and perhaps some level of natural predation. We know they understood certain natural properties. For example, marigolds, those beautiful flowers, are known to deter some nematodes in the soil. They likely practiced crop rotation within a Chinampa bed to help manage soil-borne diseases. But large-scale insect infestations or plant blights would have been a constant threat, just like for farmers anywhere. It's probable they dealt with them manually, picking off large pests like caterpillars, and relied on the rapid growth cycles to outpace some problems. If a crop was hit hard, they could quickly clear it and transplant a new set of seedlings. It was a system built for resilience through speed and constant renewal. Imagine the sounds here. The gentle lapping of water against the Chinampa edges the soft rustle of maize leaves in the breeze. The squawk of water birds, the low hum of insects, maybe a few mosquitoes, because, well, it's a lake. The quiet sounds of digging and planting. The smells would be potent, the rich, earthy scent of wet soil, the green smell of growing plants, maybe the faint, sweet perfume of flowering marigolds. It's a vibrant, living landscape. A mainstream historical fact about this system, Chinampa agriculture, was so incredibly intensive and productive that it's estimated a relatively small area could support a large number of people. Some calculations suggest that a single acre of Chinampa could feed something like 15-20 people for a year. Do the math and multiply that by the thousands of acres of Chinampa surrounding Tenochtitlan, and you start to understand how the city could sustain its huge population, estimated to be well over 100,000 people, possibly much higher, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. This wasn't just farming, it was urban-scale food production, tightly integrated with the city's needs. Now a quirky tidbit. Besides food and flowers, the Chinampas might have been used to grow other things too. There's some evidence they cultivated rushes and reeds on the edges, the very materials used to build and maintain the Chinampas themselves. It was a truly self-sustaining ecosystem, not only producing food, but potentially also the raw materials needed to expand and maintain the system. Imagine growing the bricks you need to build your house or the parts you need to maintain your car. It's that level of integrated resource management. You were constantly working with the lake's bounty, taking materials to build using its water, leveraging its nutrients, and even cultivating the materials needed for future building. Think about the skill involved. It wasn't just brute force, though. There was plenty of that in the building phase. It was knowing when to plant, when to transplant, how to spot potential problems, which muck was best for top dressing, how to work the soil just right. This knowledge was passed down through generations, honed over centuries of working this unique environment. The people tending these gardens weren't just farmers. They were environmental engineers, botanists, and soil scientists rolled into one, deeply connected to the lake they lived on and worked with. The cycle was relentless but rewarding. One crop harvested, another transplanted. The Chinampa, always green, always producing. Maize stalks giving way to bushy beans, squash vines replaced by rows of chilies. It was a constant flow of life and energy from the lake bed to the city's tables, and it required constant vigilance and effort. You couldn't just plant and walk away. You were out there day after day, tending weeding, though the dense planting and shade helped with that, checking on the plants, anticipating the next step in the cycle. It was a partnership with the land, or rather with the artificial land you had coaxed into existence from the water. It's enough to make your average modern gardener with their single tomato plant feel a little inadequate, isn't it? Or maybe just tired thinking about all that manual labor. No tractors here, just human power and ingenuity. So you're standing on your chinampa amidst the vibrant green of growing crops, perhaps transplanting those sturdy little seedlings we talked about, or maybe harvesting a crop of ripe chilies, the sun warm on your back, the rich earth smell heavy in the air. You're surrounded by water, not just as a source of life for your plants, but as the very highway connecting you to everything else. These canals, these watery streets, aren't just convenient. They are absolutely essential. Without them, the chinampas couldn't exist as they did, feeding a city. Imagine living in a place where your garden is also your island, and your transport is always by boat. It's like Venice, but built by farmers who were really, really good at engineering dirt and plants. You didn't have roads winding between these rectangular beds. You had waterways. And these waterways weren't just ditches. They were meticulously maintained canals deep enough to navigate, forming a complex network that threaded through the entire Chinampa zone and connected it directly to the city of Tenochtitlan itself. This network of canals was the lifeblood of the whole operation. They served multiple purposes. Obviously, they provided the water for the Chinampas through capillary action, keeping the soil moist. But they were also the source of that incredible nutrient-rich mud you use for building and topping up your beds. And most importantly, they were the transportation system. How did you get around? In canoes, of course. The Aztec canoe, or acali in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica people, often called Aztecs, was the indispensable vehicle of this watery world. These weren't giant ships. They were primarily dugouts carved from the trunks of large trees or sometimes constructed from planks. They came in various sizes, from small single-person vessels used for moving around your own immediate area or fishing, to larger ones capable of carrying significant loads of produce, building materials, or people. Picture yourself navigating one of these canoes. You're low in the water, gliding silently along the canal. The water's probably a bit murky from the lakebed sediments, but teeming with life. Fish, ducks, insects. The banks rise slightly, formed by the edges of the Chinampas, often reinforced with reeds or those ahuejote trees whose roots help stabilize the banks. The air might smell of damp earth-flowering plants, and perhaps the wood smoke from cooking fires on nearby Chinampas. You'd propel yourself using a paddle, pushing off the bottom in shallow areas, or simply paddling in deeper channels. It required skill and practice. Navigating a narrow canal loaded with goods isn't like cruising on open water. You had to maneuver around other canoes, around turns, and sometimes through congested areas, especially closer to the city. It was probably a bit like navigating a busy intersection, but wetter and much more peaceful, unless someone capsized their cargo of chilies. Imagine the sneeze-inducing chaos. These canoes were the essential connection between the farms and the market. Every day, vast amounts of fresh produce, flowers, herbs, and other goods grown on the Chinampas had to be transported to the city. The primary destination was the great market at Tlatelolco, right next to Tenochtitlan. Historians still argue whether Tlatelolco was the largest market in the world at the time, but it was certainly enormous, a bustling hub of commerce where goods from all over the Aztec Empire, and especially the bounty from the surrounding lake environment, were traded. So you'd load your canoe with whatever you had harvested. Maybe baskets of ripe tomatoes, bundles of maize ears, bunches of aromatic herbs, perhaps even live fish caught from the canals themselves. You might be joined by neighbors in their own canoes, forming a sort of slow-moving convoy heading toward the city. The journey could take time depending on how far your Chinampa was located from the market. For those further out in the lake system, it might be a trip that started before dawn. As you got closer to Tenochtitlan, the canals would become wider and busier. This was a city built on water, remember. Canals weren't just for agriculture. They were also the main streets of the city itself, alongside the causeways connecting the island to the mainland. You'd see canoes carrying building materials for the temples and palaces, canoes with people going about their daily lives, even canoes used by the city's waste collectors, a vital service in such a large, dense city. Imagine arriving at the edge of the market district by canoe. There would be specific areas where farmers could bring their goods ashore, offload their canoes, and set up their stalls, or simply offer their wares directly from the water's edge. The sights, sounds, and smells of the market must have been overwhelming. The din of thousands of people bartering and chatting, the aroma of roasting food incense, and 1,000 different goods, the vibrant colors of textiles, pottery, and of course, the fresh produce you just delivered. This constant flow of goods from the Chinampas via canoe was a mainstream historical fact of Aztec life and a key factor in the city's ability to grow so large. The sheer volume of food transported daily by human power poling and paddling canoes filled to the brim is astonishing to contemplate from our modern perspective of refrigerated trucks and paved highways. It required immense coordination and labor, not just in farming, but in logistics. Now, for a quirky tidbit related to these watery highways, besides carrying food and people, the canals and the canoes were also used for waste disposal, including human waste. While this might sound a bit unpleasant, it was actually part of the system. Collected human waste from the city was often brought back to the Chinampas in canoes to be used as fertilizer. Yes, you heard that right. The waste generated by the city's population helped to feed the very farms that fed the city. It was a closed-loop system of nutrient cycling, incredibly efficient, if a bit fragrant. It's probably not the kind of recycling program your local council has in mind, but it worked for them for centuries. Talk about taking reduce, reuse, recycle to an extreme level. The maintenance of these canals was an ongoing task. They needed to be regularly dredged to keep them deep enough for navigation, as they would naturally silt up from sediment washing in and organic matter accumulating. This dredging process wasn't just about keeping the waterways open. It was also the source of that precious fertile mud that was scooped from the bottom and used to top up the Chinampa beds. So the act of maintaining the transport system also provided the fertilizer for the farms. It was a perfectly integrated system. Imagine the tools for this dredging: simple scoops, woven baskets, human muscle power. It was hard, dirty work, probably done on a rotational basis or by specialized groups. Keeping that vast network of canals navigable was just as important as keeping the Chinampas productive. A blocked canal meant no transport, no fertilizer, no way to get your goods to market. The success of the entire system relied on both the artificial islands and the watery spaces between them functioning perfectly together. The canoes themselves also required upkeep. Made of wood, they were susceptible to rot and damage. They needed to be repaired, perhaps waterproofed with natural resins or tars, and eventually replaced. The forest resources required to produce the large trees needed for dugout canoes must have been significant, though plank-built canoes might have been more resource efficient. It's another layer of the complexity of the system. It relied not just on the lake environment, but also on access to mainland resources like timber. The sounds on the canals would have been distinct: the rhythmic splash of paddles, the creak of wood, the quiet glide of a hull through water, perhaps the calls of canoeists warning others of their presence around a blind turn. You wouldn't have the rumble of carts or wagons, just the sounds of water and human effort. It was a quieter, more fluid kind of traffic. From the perspective of the Chinampa farmer, the canal was their road to the world. It was how they accessed their fields if they lived in the city, how they brought materials in, how they sent their produce out. It influenced the layout of their homes if they lived on the Chinampas themselves and their daily routines. Living on the edge of a canal meant easy access to water for washing, for cooking, and for the needs of the farm. A mainstream historical fact. The scale of this water-based transportation system was immense. At its peak, the lake system around Tenochtitlan was crisscrossed by thousands of miles of canals. The number of canoes operating on these waterways is estimated to have been in the tens of thousands, potentially even more. It was one of the most extensive and efficient pre-industrial transportation networks in the world, facilitating the movement of goods and people on a scale that rivaled contemporary European cities that relied primarily on slower, less efficient land transport. This system wasn't just about moving food, it was about connecting communities. People living on different Chinampas or between the Chinampas and the city interacted constantly via the canals. They were social spaces, places where news was exchanged, where children played, where fishing happened. Life happened on and around the water. And here's another quirky tidbit. There's some fascinating evidence that certain types of water plants, like water lilies, were intentionally cultivated in the canals, not just for their beauty. They were highly valued for decoration, but potentially also for their practical uses, such as providing shade or helping to keep the water clear. It adds another layer to the intentional management of the entire lake environment, not just the dry land of the Chinampas. They were curating the waterways as well as the gardens. Think about the physical connection this created. The food on your plate in Tenochtitlan wasn't trucked in from miles away. It might have been grown on a Chinampa just a few miles across the lake, brought directly to you by canoe. It was a much more direct and immediate relationship between producer and consumer, facilitated entirely by the watery landscape. It makes you wonder about the freshness of the produce back then. Probably harvested in the morning and at market by noon. Take that modern supply chains. Though I doubt they had refrigerated canoes, so maybe some items had to move pretty fast, especially in the Mesoamerican heat. The system was so effective that even after the Spanish conquest, aspects of Chinampa agriculture and canal transport persisted for centuries. The canals eventually began to be filled in as the city grew and the lake was drained. But the core technology of the Chinampa itself proved remarkably resilient, a testament to its clever design. So you're paddling back towards your Chinampa. At the end of the day, your empty canoe riding higher in the water. The sun might be setting, casting long shadows across the water and the rows of plants. The sounds are quieter now, just the gentle dip of your paddle and the lapping water. You've spent your day working the soil, transplanting, perhaps harvesting, and maybe even making a trip to the market. Your body is tired, but you're surrounded by the results of your labor, a landscape you and your ancestors have literally built from the water. It's a profound connection to place forged through mud plants and the constant movement on these ancient waterways. It really puts your commute to work in perspective, doesn't it? Probably fewer fish swimming past your car windows, I'd guess. So you've brought your goods to market, navigating those watery highways we just talked about, maybe sold your bounty, maybe traded for something you needed, and now you're heading back towards your little floating piece of paradise. But what exactly was that bounty? What were you spending all that time building, tending and harvesting on your Chinampa? Well, pretty much everything edible and some things that weren't just for eating. The Chinampas weren't monoculture farms like a giant field of just corn or just soybeans today. They were incredibly diverse, bursting with a variety of crops that fed the people and fueled the culture of Tenochtitlan. At the absolute heart of the Aztec diet, and therefore central to Chinampa production, was maize, corn. It was the staple grain, the basis of tortillas, tamales, and countless other dishes. You would have been growing different varieties of maize, different colors, different textures suited for different purposes. The rich, fertile mud of the Chinampas combined with the constant moisture was absolutely ideal for growing maize. Unlike rain-fed fields that might yield 1 or 2 crops per year, if you were lucky with the weather on the Chinampas, with careful management, you could potentially get 3 or even 4 maize harvests annually. Imagine that kind of productivity. It's like hitting the agricultural jackpot. But maize wasn't grown alone. This is where the genius of Mesoamerican agriculture really shines through, and where the Chinampas leveraged ancient knowledge. You'd often grow maize alongside beans and squash, the famous 3 sisters. This wasn't just random planting. It was a sophisticated form of polyculture that benefited all 3 plants. The maize stalks provided a natural trellis for the climbing beans. The beans, being legumes, fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it and providing nutrients for the hungry maize and squash. And the broad leaves of the squash plant spread out at the base, shading the soil to keep it moist, suppressing weeds and deterring pests. It was a beautiful, synergistic relationship, an ecosystem in a garden bed. You were growing a miniature edible forest. Beyond the 3 sisters, the Chinampas were home to an incredible array of other foodstuffs. Tomatoes in various shapes and sizes, they originated in the region, remember? Chili peppers from mild to incredibly hot, essential for flavor and preservation. Amaranth and chia, ancient seed crops that were incredibly nutritious and important, both for food and ritual. Various kinds of greens, leafy vegetables you might recognize as precursors to things like spinach or chard, and others that are now less common. Root vegetables like sweet potatoes and jicama. Herbs for flavoring food and for medicinal purposes. The Aztecs had a sophisticated understanding of plant properties. Think about the sheer variety of colors and textures you'd see on your Chinampa. Rows of tall green maize stalks, winding bean vines with their delicate flowers, sprawling squash plants with their large leaves, and developing fruit patches of bright red tomatoes, vibrant green chili bushes, and splashes of color from flowering herbs. It wasn't just a farm, it was a living tapestry of food. A key technique that made this intensive agriculture possible on the Chinampas was the use of seed beds called almasigos. Instead of planting seeds directly into the large Chinampa beds, especially for crops like maize, tomatoes, and chilies, you would sow them densely in small, highly fertile nursery beds. Once the seedlings had sprouted and grown a few inches tall, you would carefully transplant them into the main Chinampa beds. This had several advantages. It allowed you to protect the vulnerable seedlings from pests and unpredictable weather early on. It ensured that precious seeds weren't wasted, and it allowed you to get a head start on the growing season, making those multiple harvests possible. As soon as one crop was finishing, you'd have seedlings ready to go straight into the cleared bed, keeping production continuous. It was like running a highly efficient plant factory. You'd be hunched over those little seed beds, gently coaxing life from the earth, knowing that these tiny plants were the future food for your family and your city. The fertility of the Chinampa soil was legendary, and it came from that rich mud dredged from the lake bottom, which we talked about last section. This mud wasn't just dirt, it was full of organic matter that had settled on the lake bed over centuries, plus minerals washed in from the surrounding hills. And layered with this, you'd incorporate compost, plant residues, household waste, and yes, even that human waste collected from the city via canoe. This constant topping up with fertile material meant the soil never really got depleted, unlike fields that might need to lie fallow every few years to recover. You were basically farming on a continuously renewed nutrient-rich sponge. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary this was. It was a sustainable intensification of agriculture centuries before anyone used those words. You were essentially creating new, incredibly fertile land right where you needed it most next to a growing city. And it wasn't just food. Flowers were incredibly important in Aztec society, used in rituals, decorations, and as offerings. Chinampas were major producers of flowers, adding another layer to their economic and cultural value. You might have beds dedicated solely to growing marigolds, cempasúchil dahlias, and other native blooms that were highly prized. Imagine paddling to market not just with baskets of corn and chilies, but with vibrant bouquets of freshly cut flowers, the colors and scents adding to the sensory overload of the marketplace. A quirky or fringe tidbit here. The Aztecs were particularly skilled at growing flowers, and some scholars argue that the Chinampas were originally developed specifically for high-value crops like flowers and herbs before their potential for staple food production was fully realized. So maybe your beautiful garden started as a flower farm, not a vegetable patch. Historians still argue whether flower cultivation was the initial driver or a later valuable addition to the Chinampa system. The sheer volume of food produced on these relatively small areas was astonishing. Estimates vary wildly, but some suggest that an average family Chinampa could produce enough food to support 10-20 people year-round, far exceeding the productivity of typical rain-fed agriculture elsewhere in Mesoamerica. Multiplying that across the thousands of Chinampas in the lake system, you get the food base capable of sustaining a city of hundreds of thousands of people, an urban population, density that was rare for its time. This incredible output is a mainstream historical fact. The Chinampas were an agricultural engine that powered one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas. Growing these crops required constant work. Weeding was crucial, especially in such fertile, moist conditions where everything wanted to grow. Irrigation wasn't usually an issue due to the capillary action from the surrounding water, but managing water levels in the canals could be important. Pest control would have involved natural methods, perhaps using certain plants to deter insects or manually removing pests. And then there was the harvest, an ongoing process throughout much of the year, especially with multiple cropping cycles. You weren't waiting for one big harvest season. You were constantly planting, tending, and reaping. Imagine the rhythm of life dictated by the plants. Waking up with the sun heading out to your Chinampa, the air cool and damp over the water. Spending the day tending your crops, perhaps transplanting those sturdy little maize seedlings you grew in your almacigo, or carefully harvesting ripe tomatoes, plucking them gently from the vine. feeling the rich, dark soil between your fingers, smelling the earth and the plants. Hearing the buzz of insects drawn to the flowers, the calls of birds in the reeds along the canal banks. It was a life deeply connected to the natural world, albeit a highly managed and engineered version of it. The diversity of crops grown on the Chinampas also contributed to a relatively balanced and nutritious diet for the city's inhabitants. Maize provided carbohydrates, beans provided protein, squash and other vegetables provided vitamins and minerals. Amaranth and chia offered protein and essential fatty acids. It wasn't just a high-calorie diet, it was relatively complete, contributing to the health and vitality of the population. It makes you wonder if they had the equivalent of a superfood aisle at the Tlatelolco market featuring chia seeds, marketed for their energy-boosting properties. Probably not, but they knew instinctively which plants gave them what they needed. Another quirky tidbit. Besides the main food crops, Chinampas were also used to cultivate other useful plants like reeds and rushes, used for building materials, mats and baskets. Even the stabilizing ahuejote trees planted along the edges had multiple uses, providing shade wood and helping to prevent erosion. So your floating farm was a source not just of food, but of raw materials for daily life, creating a truly integrated system of production. It wasn't just about filling stomachs. It was about providing for the whole household economy. It's like your garden center also stocked lumber and craft supplies. The process of growing on Chinampas, from preparing the seed beds to transplanting, tending, and harvesting, required significant knowledge and skill passed down through generations. It wasn't simple farming, it was an advanced form of horticulture adapted specifically to the lake environment. The success of the entire system rested on the collective knowledge and patient labor of the Chinampa farmers. They were environmental engineers and master gardeners, shaping the landscape and coaxing immense productivity from it. Think about the satisfaction of a successful harvest. Loading your canoe with baskets overflowing with fresh produce, knowing you had grown all of it yourself on the land you helped to build. The feeling of contributing to the sustenance of your family and your community, feeding a mighty city. It was hard work, certainly exposed to the elements, dealing with pests and occasional floods, though the Chinampa height helped mitigate this, but the rewards were tangible and vital. You weren't just digging in the dirt, you were participating in an agricultural miracle. The legacy of these Chinampa crops continues today, of course. Maize, beans, squash tomatoes, chilies. These plants that were central to the Aztec diet and were perfected on the Chinampas are now consumed worldwide. When you bite into a tomato or add chili to your food, you're connecting in a small way to the bounty that once flowed from those ancient floating gardens on Lake Texcoco. It's a tasty connection, though, hopefully less likely to involve fertilizer delivery by canoe these days. So surrounded by your thriving crops, you're witnessing the culmination of all that effort. The stakes, the reeds, the mud, the careful layering, the constant tending, the transport via canal. This wasn't just subsistence farming, it was high-yield, sophisticated agriculture that allowed a civilization to flourish in an unlikely environment. You're not just growing food, you're participating in a system that shaped history. So you've spent your days coaxing life from the mud, tending your maize, your beans, your squash, your vibrant chili peppers, maybe even those prized flowers, seeing your Chinampa burst with productivity. But all that bounty isn't much use if it just sits there anchored to its little patch of watery earth. This is where the network comes alive, the intricate web of canals that wasn't just the boundary around your farm, but the highway from your farm to the world beyond. These canals were the lifeblood of the Chinampa system, the watery veins connecting every single floating garden to the next, and eventually to the bustling heart of Tenochtitlan. Think of it like a super efficient ancient transit system, but instead of trains or cars, the vehicles were canoes and the roads were liquid. There were main arteries wide enough for multiple canoes to pass comfortably, and smaller capillaries branching off, leading into the more secluded corners of the Chinampa zone, right up to the edge of your own plot. You could step out of your home, which was often built right there on the Nampa, or on a slightly larger, more stable island nearby, and directly onto your waiting canoe. It was the ultimate in waterfront access, minus the exorbitant property taxes, presumably. Though who knows, maybe there was an ancient Aztec version of a canal use fee, probably involved cacao beans. Navigating this network was an essential skill. You learned it from childhood balancing in the narrow vessels, mastering the rhythm of the paddle, or the long pole used in shallower areas. Canoes came in various sizes and designs tailored for different purposes. There were small, nimble canoes for a single person or a few passengers, perfect for visiting neighbors, checking on distant plots, or just getting around your immediate area. Then there were larger, sturdier canoes designed to carry heavy loads. Piled high with harvested crops, baskets of fertile mud, dredged from the canal bottom, a constant necessary chore bundles of reeds for construction, or even passengers heading to market or ceremonies. These were essentially the Aztec equivalent of pickup trucks and delivery vans silently gliding through the water. The sheer scale of this canal system is hard to grasp today. It wasn't just a few ditches, it was a vast interconnected matrix covering tens, perhaps even hundreds of square miles. Imagine a city built not just on water, but integrated with water in such a fundamental way that dry land was almost secondary. For the Shanampa residents, the canals were their streets, their alleys, their connection to the outside world. You didn't walk to your neighbor's house, you paddled. You didn't haul goods down a road, you loaded them into a canoe. The water itself played a crucial role, obviously. It wasn't just a medium for transport, it was the constant source of moisture for the Shinampas through capillary action and the source of the fertile mud. Maintaining the canals was ongoing work. They needed to be periodically dredged to keep them navigable and to provide that essential mud. The edges needed to be reinforced often with woven reeds or planting more of those sturdy ahuejote trees, which helped prevent erosion and kept the waterways clear. It was a continuous process of management, an ancient infrastructure project that never really finished. Life on the canals had its own rhythm. In the early morning, you'd hear the gentle dip and pull of paddles as farmers headed out to their plots, perhaps carrying tools or supplies. As the day progressed, the traffic would increase, especially as people transported goods to market. Larger canoes laden with produce would glide towards the city, joining a silent procession of commerce. There might be canoes carrying people visiting relatives, or perhaps officials making inspections, though hopefully they gave you a heads up before they arrived. Nobody likes surprise visitors, especially when you live on a floating island. The soundscape was dominated by natural sounds. Water lapping against the canoe sides, the calls of waterfowl, and the occasional low murmur of voices from passing vessels. No engine noise, no traffic jams, just the quiet efficiency of human power and hydrodynamics. It sounds quite peaceful, doesn't it? Almost makes you want to trade your car for a canoe until you remember modern sanitation exists. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this system: the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was also crisscrossed with canals, effectively bringing the waterway network right into the city center. Chinampa farmers could paddle their loaded canoes directly to the famous market of Tlatelolco, one of the largest markets in the world at the time. Imagine arriving at the equivalent of a massive farmer's market, but you literally paddled your stall, your canoe overflowing with fresh produce right up to the selling area. There were designated docking areas for the Chinampa canoes, a specific waterfront marketplace just for these floating garden vendors. It eliminated the need for any intermediate transport. Your farm was directly connected to the consumer hub. Talk about farm to table. It was more like farm to market canal side. This seamless connection between production area and consumption center is a mainstream historical fact, and a key reason for Tenochtitlan's ability to feed its massive population. The efficient transport via canoe over the canal network allowed for rapid movement of perishable goods from the Chinampas to the city, minimizing spoilage and ensuring a constant fresh supply of food. Without this sophisticated logistical system, the city simply couldn't have grown to the size it did. It wasn't just about growing the food, it was about getting it where it needed to go quickly and reliably. The canals also facilitated the movement of people for social and religious purposes. You might paddle to a neighboring community for a festival or a wedding. Religious processions could take place on the water, with canoes decorated and filled with participants and offerings. The lake system and its canals were not just economic infrastructure, they were deeply integrated into the social and cultural fabric of life. You lived on in the water, you traveled by water, and water was part of your community's identity. Maintaining a canoe required skill as well. They were typically made by hollowing out large logs or by plank construction, joined with fiber ropes and sealed with pitch. Repairs would be necessary, and the ability to mend a leak or strengthen a hull was probably another practical skill passed down through families. Imagine your canoe springing a leak miles from your chinampa, loaded down with the day's harvest. You'd better hope you paid attention during canoeing maintenance lessons. It wasn't exactly Iori for ancient Aztec boaters. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the canal network was initially for drainage and land reclamation, with transport as a secondary benefit, or if the transport aspect was central to the design from the beginning, driven by the need to move goods and people to the growing city. It's a bit of a chicken and egg question about ancient urban planning. Did they build the canals to make land farmable and then realize they were great for transport, or did they need to transport goods to a growing city and thus developed the Chinampa system and its canals together? Either way, the end result was a brilliantly integrated system. The canals also served other purposes. They provided a buffer zone between Chinampas, helping to define property boundaries, though disputes probably still happened, maybe settled with competitive paddling. They were also a source of fish and other aquatic life, adding another element to the local diet and economy. Fishing from your canoe right next to your floating farm would have been a common sight. It's like having your own personal grocery store and fish market right outside your door. Think about the physicality of this life. Paddling a loaded canoe is hard work requiring strength and endurance. Poling in shallow water is also demanding. You were constantly engaged with the environment, using your own body to move yourself and your goods. There was no coasting, no putting it in neutral. It was all manual power, muscle, and skill. It makes sitting in rush hour traffic feel less like a chore and more like a mild inconvenience by comparison. Though you probably weren't dodging other canoes driven by people late for their ancient Aztec office jobs, the complexity of the canal system, with its various widths, depths, and connections, speaks to a high level of engineering and planning. It wasn't just a natural feature, it was a designed landscape. They understood the flow of water, the needs of navigation, and how to integrate this infrastructure with their agricultural and urban goals. This mastery of hydraulic engineering is a significant, if often overlooked, achievement of the Aztec civilization. They weren't just building pyramids, they were building functional, complex water systems that sustained their society. The daily life you'd experience on the canals would change with the seasons and the time of day. Early morning mist rising from the water, the canals smooth and quiet. Midday hustle and bustle as goods moved towards the city. Late afternoon, people returning home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the water. Evenings, perhaps, just the soft splash of a paddle as someone made a quick trip under the moonlight. The canals were never truly empty. They were the constant flowing presence that defined the Chinampa world. It wasn't just about functional transport either. The canals were part of the beauty of the landscape, with the lush green of the Chinampas rising from the water, framed by the reeds and trees along the banks, and the distant view of the volcanoes on a clear day paddling through the network must have been a visually rich experience. It was an artificial landscape, yes, but one that worked in harmony with nature, creating a unique and fertile environment. Like a really successful piece of land art that also happens to feed hundreds of thousands of people. The skills associated with canoe navigation and canal maintenance were vital, passed down through generations of Chinampa dwellers. Children learned to paddle almost as soon as they could walk. The collective knowledge of the waterway system was a form of communal wealth, essential for everyone's livelihood and connection to the city. It reinforces the idea that the Chinampa system was more than just a farming technique. It was a complete way of life deeply intertwined with the lake environment and its engineered waterways. And as you glide along, perhaps towards market with your precious cargo of tomatoes and chilies, or maybe back towards your Chinampa, after a trip to the city, you appreciate the silent efficiency of it all. The water supports you, the canals guide you, and your efforts on the land are made meaningful by this vital link. It's a quiet journey punctuated only by the sounds of your movement and the distant life of the lake. It's a feeling of being perfectly integrated into a system that works in ancient network, humming along, powered by water and human effort. So you've nurtured your plants, managed the soil, navigated the watery pathways, and now comes the payoff, or at least the chance at one. It's market day, and you've carefully harvested the best of your Chinampa's bounty. Maybe it's plump tomatoes, glossy obsidian-like chilies, crisp squash, or bundles of fragrant herbs. Perhaps it's those prized flowers you cultivated destined for temple offerings or noble homes. You gather your harvest, sorting and arranging the produce into sturdy baskets or woven mats. It's a moment of quiet satisfaction, seeing the tangible result of your labor, the vibrant colors and fresh scents filling the air. Loading the canoe is a practiced art. You need to distribute the weight evenly to avoid capsizing, a mistake that would ruin your day and your inventory in a single wet disaster. Baskets are carefully placed in the bottom, sometimes covered with damp leaves to keep things fresh. Larger items might be lashed down. You settle into your spot, grab your paddle or pole, and push off from the edge of your chinampa or docking area. The water is cool and calm in the early morning, reflecting the pre-dawn light. Your journey begins on the smaller, familiar canals of your immediate neighborhood. Other canoes are starting to stir, shadowy shapes gliding through the mist, fellow farmers heading towards the main arteries. There's a quiet camaraderie in these early hours, perhaps a nod or shared glance as you pass. You might hear the distant sounds of other families preparing, the low murmur of voices, the gentle splashing of water. As you paddle toward the city, the canals gradually widen and become busier. The traffic increases. Not cars, remember, but canoes of all sizes. There are other farmers like you, laden with goods. There are fishermen heading out or returning with their catch. There might be laborers transporting building materials, or perhaps even nobles or officials being paddled by servants. The peaceful quiet of the chinampa zone gives way to a more active soundscape. The steady rhythmic dipping of paddles, the calls of boatmen, warning of their approach around, bends the distant sounds of the city growing louder. You navigate through junctions and intersections in this ancient watery highway system. It requires concentration. You don't want to collide with another vessel, especially with a canoe full of precious produce. It's like merging onto a freeway, but way more serene, and with a much lower risk of road rage, presumably. Though historians still argue whether disputes over canal etiquette or fishing rights ever escalated to more than just stern looks and sharp words. As you approach the island city of Tenochtitlan, the landscape changes. The low-lying chinampas give way to more permanent structures built on larger islands or reclaimed land. You begin to see the impressive architecture of the capital. The white stucco of buildings, the rising forms of temples and palaces in the distance. The smell of wood smoke mixes with the earthy scent of the lake and the aromas of food preparation wafting from the city. The canals here are wider still, lined with stone embankments in some areas. You paddle past causeways connecting the island to the mainland, bustling with pedestrian traffic. The sheer scale of the city is awe-inspiring. Tenochtitlan was massive, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, and its lifeblood flowed through these waterways. You are part of that flow, bringing the sustenance that feeds this urban giant. Your destination is the market of Tlatelolco, a vast square located just north of the central ceremonial precinct. Tlatelolco wasn't just a market, it was the market, the economic heart of the empire. And uniquely, a significant part of it was directly accessible by canoe. You steer towards the designated docking area for incoming chinampa traffic. As you get closer, the noise level dramatically increases. The sounds of the city converge on the market, the hubbub of thousands of voices, the cries of vendors, the bleating of animals, the clatter of pottery, the rhythmic pounding of maize being ground. It's a sensory explosion after the relative quiet of your journey. Pulling your canoe alongside the market quay is like parking at a bustling farmer's market, only you arrived by boat. Other canoes are already lined up, their occupants busy unloading or arranging their goods for display. You secure your canoe and begin the work of transferring your baskets and bundles to your chosen selling spot on the quay or in a nearby designated area. This waterfront section was specifically for produce, arriving by water, a testament to the vital role of the chinampa system. Stepping out of the canoe and onto the market ground, you are immediately immersed in the vibrant chaos. The sheer variety of goods on display is staggering. Not just produce from the chinampas, but goods from all corners of the Aztec Empire and beyond. You see pottery, textiles, obsidian tools, feathered cloaks, precious metals, jewelry, medicinal herbs, live animals including yes dogs raised for food, cacao beans, vanilla rubber, and countless other items. It's an ancient supermarket and department store rolled into one, a place of immense economic activity and social interaction. A mainstream historical fact is that Tlatelolco market was meticulously organized. Different types of goods were sold in specific designated areas. There were market officials known as calpixque, who oversaw transactions, settled disputes, and ensured fair trade. They were the market police, and regulators rolled into one, making sure nobody was cheating on measurements or selling shoddy goods. The penalty for cheating could be severe, which probably encouraged honesty. Mostly. Your focus is, of course, selling your own produce. You arrange your tomatoes, chilies, and squash to look as appealing as possible. You call out to potential customers, extolling the freshness and quality of your Chinampa-grown goods. People mill about examining the produce, haggling over prices. The primary currency was not metal coins, but cacao beans. You'd count out handfuls of beans for smaller purchases, or perhaps use cotton cloaks or other goods for larger transactions. Imagine paying for your week's groceries with chocolate. Well, not exactly chocolate bars, but the raw ingredient. A small number of beans for a few tomatoes more for a basket of chilies. It adds a unique sensory element to the transaction. The dry rattle and slightly bitter smell of the beans as they change hands. It's certainly different from swiping a credit card. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the market. According to some accounts by the Spanish conquistadors who were utterly amazed by the market's size and organization, there was even an area where you could buy, well, let's just say, prepared food, like ancient Aztec street food vendors offering hot meals or snacks. So after a long paddle and a morning of selling, you could potentially grab a quick bite right there at the market. Maybe some maize cakes, or perhaps something involving those edible dogs if you were feeling adventurous. The market was more than just commerce. It was a social hub. You'd see people from all walks of life hear a multitude of languages, spoken by traders from different regions, and catch up on news and gossip. It was a place to see and be seen to learn what was happening in the city and the wider empire. For a Chinampa farmer, it was their main connection to the urban world, a break from the quiet rhythm of life on the water. Selling your harvest could take hours. Some days might be more successful than others. You'd haggle, chat with customers, and interact with other vendors. It was a direct link between the food producer and the consumer, a relationship facilitated by the efficient canoe transport system you just used. Once your goods are sold or you've decided you've sold enough for the day, you might spend some time exploring other parts of the market, maybe buying supplies for your Chinampa or goods for your family, tools, clothing, pottery, or perhaps a treat like some vanilla or cochineal dye. Finally, with your canoe now lighter perhaps, weighted down slightly with new purchases, or just empty, you begin the journey back. The canals are still busy, but maybe less frantic than they were earlier. The afternoon sun reflects brightly off the water. As you paddle away from the city and back towards the Chinampa zone, the sounds of the market gradually fade, replaced once again by the quieter lapping of water and the calls of birds. You return to your watery home, perhaps tired but with a sense of accomplishment and maybe a handful of cacao beans jingling in a small pouch. The journey to market and back was an essential part of the Chinampa farmer's life, linking their labor directly to the heart of the Aztec world. It wasn't just about growing food, it was about participating in a complex, interconnected system that made this unique civilization possible. And all thanks to some mud patience and a network of ancient waterways. You're back from the bustling market, perhaps a little tired, but with the satisfaction of a successful day's trade. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the water. You've put away your supplies, maybe shared a meal with your family, and the quiet rhythm of Chinampa life reasserts itself. But the return from the market, the selling of the harvest, is never the end of the work. In fact, it often signals the beginning of another cycle of tasks, the essential, unending maintenance that keeps this entire ingenious system functioning. Your farm isn't just a patch of land. It's a dynamic living structure that constantly needs tending, feeding, and reinforcing. It's like owning a very hungry, slightly leaky boat that also grows your food. And one of the most crucial, back-breaking, and surprisingly elegant parts of this cycle is canal maintenance, specifically dredging. Remember those watery pathways you paddled down on your way to Tlatelolco? They aren't static features. Over time, silt, organic matter from decaying plants, and even the occasional dropped paddle or stray reed bundle settle at the bottom. If you don't clear it out, the canals get shallower and shallower. First, your canoe starts scraping the bottom, then they become impassable. This would cut off your access to the city to neighbors and disrupt the delicate flow of water around your Chinampa. So dredging is non-negotiable. The tools for this task are simple but effective long poles with some sort of scooping or grabbing device at the end. Think of a giant ladle or a claw on a stick. You stand in your canoe or along the edge of the canal and reach down, scooping up handfuls or scoopfuls of the rich, dark, sometimes rather smelly mud from the canal bed. It's a physical job. You lean over, push the pole down, feel it sink into the thick sediment scoop, and then heave the heavy dripping mud up and over the side of your canoe or directly onto the edge of your chinampa plot. The mud is heavy, full of water and decaying organic matter. It smells of the lake of earth and of decomposition, the smell of fertility if you want to be poetic, or just the smell of really wet dirt if you don't. This isn't just about keeping the canals clear. Oh no, this is a brilliant closed-loop system at work. The mud you dredge from the canal bottom is incredibly rich in nutrients. It's packed with decomposed plant material, fish waste, and all sorts of organic goodies that have settled there. This isn't waste, it's pure unadulterated fertilizer. So as you dredge, you're not just digging, you're harvesting the lake's bounty to feed your farm. You pile the dark, rich mud onto the surface of your chinampa. You spread it out evenly, adding a fresh layer of nutrient-rich soil to your plot. This is why chinampas remained so incredibly productive for centuries without needing external fertilizers. The system fertilized itself using the sediment from its own waterways. It's the ultimate recycling program, way ahead of its time. No fancy chemical bags, just good old-fashioned mud and muscle. You might do this section by section, clearing a length of canal bordering one side of your chinampa, then moving on. It's tedious, repetitive work. Scoop, lift, plop. Scoop, lift, plop. Hour after hour, you develop a rhythm, a steady pace that you can maintain. Your muscles ache, your hands are probably caked in mud gloves. What are those? But you know you're doing something essential. It's like cleaning out your gutters, but instead of just bagging the gunk, you're using it to make your lawn grow better. If your lawn was made of reeds and mud, that is. Besides dredging, there's the constant need for structural repairs. Remember how these plots are basically giant floating rafts of organic matter held together by stakes and willpower. The edges can crumble, especially after heavy rain, or if a canoe bumps into them a bit too forcefully. You need to repair these edges, reinforcing them with fresh reed stakes and more mud. It's like patching up a persistent slow leak, but with dirt. You might spend a day gathering bundles of reeds from the shallower parts of the lake, tying them together, and then carefully placing them along a collapsing edge, pushing stakes through to hold them in place. Then you pack mud behind the reeds, rebuilding the bank. It's like weaving a living basket that holds your farm together. This constant battle against erosion is a never-ending task. Then there are the larger maintenance projects. Sometimes a whole section of a chinampa might need serious rebuilding, or a major canal needs collective dredging effort from multiple families. These larger tasks often involve community cooperation. Remember how neighbors helped each other? This is where that really comes into play. You might join a work party with families from nearby chinampas to clear a particularly choked canal or reinforce a shared waterway. It's a form of ancient community service, or maybe just enlightened self-interest, because if the main canal is blocked, nobody gets to market. Historians still argue whether these community labor efforts were purely voluntary or if there was some form of social obligation or even pressure involved. Another quirky or fringe tidbit about chinampa maintenance. There's some speculation that even the waste from the city might have eventually found its way back into the lake system in a way that contributed to the fertility of the chinampas through sediment flow and decomposition. While direct application of human waste like night soil wasn't the primary method, like dredging the interconnectedness of the lake, and the city meant that organic matter from urban areas could indirectly enrich the system over time. Talk about closing the loop on everything. This continuous cycle of dredging, mucking, and repairing is fundamental to the chinampa's sustainability. It's not just about preventing the canals from silting up. It's about constantly feeding the soil, ensuring it remains fertile year after year, decade after decade, even century after century. Without this ongoing maintenance, the system would literally decay and wash away. A mainstream historical fact is that the Aztec rulers understood the vital importance of the chinampa system and the canals. They organized and enforced large-scale dredging projects on the major waterways leading to the city to ensure food transport and travel remained possible. Special officials were likely in charge of overseeing the maintenance of the main arteries, while individual families were responsible for their smaller localized canals and plots. It was a layered system of responsibility from the individual farmer up to the imperial administration. Think about it, you are literally building and rebuilding your farm every year, maybe even multiple times a year, using material harvested from the water around you. It's a constant negotiation with the environment, a tireless effort to maintain the delicate balance between land and water. It's hard work, manual labor, in its purest form under the sun, dealing with mud and water all day. Probably makes your modern-day chore list look like a spa vacation. Oh no, I have to unload the dishwasher. Sakuri Hyunto. Meanwhile, you're out here wrestling with a pole full of mud trying to keep your entire farm from sinking. Adds a bit of perspective, doesn't it? This endless cycle of maintenance, dredging canals, piling mud, repairing banks, is as much a part of the Shinampa farmer's life as planting and harvesting. It's the behind-the-scenes work that keeps the engine running. It's the quiet, often unseen effort that transforms a watery landscape into one of the most productive agricultural systems the world has ever known. And as the sun finally sets, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple over the lake, you might look at your mud-caked hands and the freshly piled soil on your plot with a weary sense of accomplishment. The work is never truly done. But for today, this section of canal is clear. This bank is reinforced and your farm is ready for the next planting. The sun has dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the soft glow of twilight. The air cools slightly, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from cooking fires. You've rinsed the mud from your hands and maybe your feet eaten a simple meal of tortillas, beans, and whatever vegetables are in season from your plot. The gentle lapping of water against the sides of your chinampa is the soundtrack to the evening. Maybe you sit with your family tending to small tasks by the fading light, repairing a fishing net, weaving a mat from reeds, sharpening a stone tool. But as the light fades completely and the stars begin to appear over the lake, the rhythms of the Shinampa don't entirely cease. They merely shift, preparing for the next cycle. Sleep comes relatively early, dictated by the sun, because the day starts well before it rises again. You wake in the dark, guided by habit and the faint glimmer of pre-dawn light on the water. The air is cool and damp. There's no hitting a snooze button on your reed mat, trust me. The first tasks often involve the seed beds. Remember those carefully prepared little squares? They need checking, maybe a gentle watering if the night was dry. You run your fingers over the tiny sprouts, checking for pests, whispering encouragement to the future harvest. It's a quiet, meditative start to the day, just you, the plants, and the slowly lightening sky. As the sun peaks over the distant volcanoes, the Chinampa comes alive. You might spend the early hours tending to the main plots. This could mean planting new seedlings. Perhaps those tomatoes or chilies you started in the seed beds are now ready to be transplanted. You work methodically, using a simple digging stick to make holes, carefully placing the delicate roots and patting the rich mud around them. Or maybe it's weeding. The incredible fertility of the Shinampa means everything grows, including weeds, and keeping them in check is a constant battle. You kneel or squat, pulling out the unwanted plants by hand, tossing them into the canal to decompose and eventually become future fertilizer. See, even the weeds are recycled. Watering is another crucial task, especially during the dry season. You don't have a sprinkler system, obviously. Watering involves dipping a pot or a gourd into the surrounding canal and carrying the water back to pour gently around the base of the plants. This might sound tedious, and it is, but because the water table is so close to the surface of the Shinampa plots, the plant's roots are always close to moisture. The Chinampa system is naturally sub-irrigated to a degree, but supplemental watering is still necessary, especially for young plants or during hot periods. You get good at judging exactly how much water each plant needs. It's less about drowning them and more about offering a refreshing drink. As the day warms up, the tasks might shift. Perhaps it's time to harvest some of the mature crops. Squash, beans, maybe some herbs or flowers. You gather the produce, carefully filling baskets to take to the market later in the week, or simply for your family's needs that day. The satisfaction of picking food you grew yourself, food that came directly from this ingenious mud and water system, is immense. You might break for a simple meal midday, finding shade under a small shelter you've built, or the leaves of a large plant. The heat of the sun on the water can be intense. Then it's back to work. More weeding perhaps, repairing a section of the edge that's starting to crumble, tying up climbing plants like beans, or dealing with pests. Pests were definitely a thing. Caterpillars, birds, maybe even small rodents or insects. Dealing with them likely involved manual removal or perhaps using natural deterrents if any were known. No pesticides here, just vigilance and elbow grease. This daily routine varies with the seasons, of course. There isn't just one planting season on a Chinampa, there are multiple. Because of the consistent moisture and the incredible fertility, you could get many harvests per year, sometimes up to 7, depending on the crop and the climate. This was a mainstream historical fact that blew people's minds. These plots were ridiculously productive compared to traditional rain-fed farming. This high yield was one of the key reasons the massive population of Tenochtitlan could be fed. Spring might be focused on preparing the ground after the cooler months and planting the main staples like maize beans and squash. Summer with the increased rain and heat is a period of rapid growth and intense weeding, followed by the first major harvest. Autumn brings more harvesting and preparing for cooler weather crops, or perhaps letting some plots rest. Winter, though not harsh in central Mexico, might see slower growth maintenance tasks like major dredging and planning for the next year. Crop rotation and multi-cropping were essential strategies. You wouldn't just grow maize in the same spot year after year. You'd rotate crops to prevent specific nutrient depletion and break pest cycles. Even within the same plot, you'd often see multiple crops growing together. Maize providing stalks for beans to climb squash, spreading broad leaves to suppress weeds and keep the soil cool and moist. This polyculture approach was incredibly efficient and resilient. It's like having a tiny edible ecosystem on your plot. Historians still argue whether the specific patterns of crop rotation were based on empirical observation and accumulated wisdom alone, or if there was a more centralized, perhaps even ritualistic element to deciding planting schedules across the Chinampa zones. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the daily rhythm might involve the role of specific rituals or prayers associated with planting growth and harvest. While the hard work was practical, the Aztecs were deeply spiritual, and it's likely that daily or seasonal tasks were accompanied by small offerings or prayers to agricultural deities like Tlaloc, the rain god, or Chikamacotl, the goddess of maize and sustenance, seeking their favor for a good harvest. Your daily grind wasn't just labor. It was potentially intertwined with acts of devotion, a blend of the utterly practical and the deeply spiritual that is hard for us to fully grasp today. Imagine pausing your weeding to offer a small piece of food or incense to the earth or the sky. It puts a different spin on connecting with nature. The day continues with tasks tailored to the needs of the plants and the season. Maybe you're gathering reeds for repair, or preparing more mud, or hauling produce. The rhythm is steady, demanding, but also deeply connected to the cycles of nature. You are constantly observing your plants, the water levels, the weather patterns, making small adjustments, responding to the needs of your living farm. As the afternoon wears on, you might see neighbors on their own plots engaged in similar tasks. There's a sense of shared purpose, a quiet understanding of the challenges and rewards of this unique way of life. You might exchange greetings, maybe a bit of gossip, because even ancient farmers had time for gossip, probably complaining about the price of chilies or the amount of dredging needed that year. The beauty of the Chinampa system beyond its productivity was its resilience and sustainability. It was a system that, when maintained, could essentially feed itself and its community indefinitely. The daily and seasonal rhythms you followed weren't just tasks. They were the ongoing performance of an ecological ballet, a centuries-old dance with the lake and the land that kept an entire civilization fed. It was a testament to patience, observation, and relentless hard work. And as you head back towards your simple home structure on the edge of the plot, as the sun begins its descent, leaving the field silent again under the watchful eye of the volcanoes, you carry the weariness of honest labor and the quiet satisfaction of having played your part in the never-ending cycle of life on the water. As the sun climbs higher and you continue your work on your plot, you start to notice the activity beyond your immediate patch of earth. The canals around you aren't just irrigation ditches. They are the lifeblood of this entire floating landscape. They are the roads, the highways, the connective tissue that links your little island of mud to your neighbors, to the wider Chinampa zone, and ultimately to the bustling heart of the city across the water. You see canoes gliding by, laden with produce, heading to market, or perhaps carrying people visiting friends or family. But these vital waterways don't maintain themselves. Oh no. Keeping them open deep enough for navigation and functional for irrigation requires constant, relentless effort dredging. This is the necessary, often backbreaking communal task that underpins the entire system. While you spend much of your time coaxing life from the soil on your chinampa, a significant portion of your time and the time of everyone in the community is dedicated to keeping the canals clear. Imagine the scene. Groups of people, maybe your family, maybe neighbors you've joined forces with, working along the edge of a canal. You're not just pulling weeds from your plot anymore. You're wrestling with the accumulated silt-decaying plant matter and general muck that constantly settles on the canal bottom. It's a messy, smelly job involving long poles, maybe some specialized tools designed to scoop or scrape the thick black sediment from the canal bed. You heave the heavy dripping mud onto flat-bottom canoes or reed mats the water churning around you. Why bother with this smelly, strenuous work? Several reasons, all absolutely critical. First, you need to maintain depth for the canoes. This isn't just for leisure, it's how everything moves. Your produce goes to market, building materials arrive, people travel. If the canals silt up, the whole transport system grinds to a halt. Second, maintaining depth ensures proper water circulation around the chinampas. Stagnant water isn't good for much. And third, and perhaps most importantly from a farming perspective, that black, stinky muck you're dredging up. That's pure, unadulterated fertilizer. Remember how fertile the chinampas were? It wasn't magic. It was largely this constant recycling of organic matter from the canals onto the plots. The very act of maintaining the waterways provided the essential nutrients for the crops. It's an incredibly elegant, if labor-intensive, closed-loop system. You might spend several days or even weeks each year focused solely on dredging. It's likely organized communally, perhaps, with specific sections of canal assigned to different families or neighborhoods. This type of required community labor for public works is a mainstream historical fact found in many complex societies, and the Aztecs were no exception. Maintaining the vast network of canals and causeways around Tenochtitlan would have required significant organization and manpower, possibly through systems of mandatory labor service known as coeducatl or tecatl. So while your days on the chinampa might feel isolated at times, the essential infrastructure that makes it all possible demands collaboration. You work alongside others, the rhythmic splashing of water, and the grunt of effort creating a different kind of soundscape than the quiet tending of plants. Historians might still argue whether the specific organization and enforcement of canal maintenance labor fell under local community governance, the authority of the Calpulli neighborhood, chart ward units, or direct oversight from the higher levels of the Aztec state in Tenochtitlan, especially for the major channels connecting the zones. It was likely a combination, with local groups responsible for smaller canals and the state directing larger strategic waterway projects. But regardless of the exact administrative layer the mud had to move, and you were part of the team moving it, a quirky or fringe tidbit might involve the tools used. While simple poles and baskets were common, there's some speculation about whether they used anything more sophisticated, perhaps wooden scrapers or scoops designed specifically for shifting large volumes of mud. Or perhaps there were specific chants or work songs used to synchronize the dredging efforts, making the repetitive labor slightly less tedious and building camaraderie among the workers. Imagine everyone heaving together to a shared rhythm, the sounds echoing over the water. Hauling the dredged mud back to your chinampa plot is another step. You load it into baskets carried on your back or onto smaller canoes to paddle over. Then you spread the rich black material over the surface of your garden bed. It's heavy work, but you know that this mud, which smelled so strongly of decomposition just hours ago, is now revitalizing your soil, preparing it for the next round of planting. It's the ultimate organic fertilizer delivered right to your doorstep or, well, your waterfront. This constant battle against siltation highlights a key challenge of the chinampa system. It is incredibly productive, but also incredibly demanding in terms of maintenance. Ignore the canals and the whole system starts to choke. Ignore the need for fresh mud and the productivity drops. The rhythm of life isn't just about planting and harvesting. It's equally about digging and hauling, about moving earth and water to keep the cycle flowing. It's a reminder that this wasn't a passive system. It was a dynamic interaction with the environment, one that required constant human intervention to thrive. The contrast between the quiet, solitary work of tending individual plants and the communal, physically demanding work of dredging the canals is stark. One is about gentle nurturing, the other is about brute force and cooperation. Both are equally essential to your survival and the survival of the entire community built on the water. As you finish spreading a fresh layer of mud on a plot, smoothing it with your hands, you feel the weight of that effort in your muscles, but also the promise of future growth. It's a direct, tangible connection between hard labor, community effort, and the food that will sustain you. You've been wrestling with the mud, feeling the ache in your back from the dredging, spreading that rich, dark earth like some kind of pungent organic icing over your plots. It's honest work, essential work, but it's also deeply physical and frankly, not always glamorous. But now as you survey your piece of this watery world, you realize something important. The Chinampa isn't just a factory for maize or beans. It's a canvas, a versatile space capable of producing so much more than just the basic foodstuffs that keep you alive. Sure, the staple crops are vital. They are the foundation of your diet, the reason you spend so much time knee-deep in mud. But look closer at the edges of your plot, or perhaps a section you've deliberately set aside. You see bursts of color that aren't just green leaves. You see delicate petals, vibrant hues, fragrances wafting on the gentle breeze across the water. You are also a grower of flowers. Flowers might seem like a luxury in a society focused on survival, but here they are anything but. They are woven into the very fabric of life, death, and everything in between. These aren't just pretty things to put in a vase. They are essential for religious ceremonies, for offerings to the gods, for decorating temples and homes for personal adornment, and even for medicinal purposes or dyes. Growing them on your Chinampa isn't just a hobby. It's another source of income, another way to participate in the economy and culture of your world. Imagine the vibrant marigolds, the cempasúchil, a brilliant orange and yellow splash against the green. These are more than just cheerful blooms. They are deeply symbolic, often used in rituals honoring the dead. Or maybe you cultivate the delicate white flowers of the izquixochitl, used for flavoring chocolate and for perfumes. The air around your plot on certain days would be thick with the scent of different blossoms, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of the mud you were just hauling. Cultivating flowers requires a different kind of care than growing sturdy maize stalks. It's more delicate, more focused on aesthetics and scent, as well as growth. You need to know which varieties thrive in the wet conditions, which need specific types of soil or sun exposure, limited as it might be by surrounding reeds or taller crops. You might have specialized areas for different types, creating a patchwork of colors and textures on your floating garden. It's a mainstream historical fact that flowers, particularly those used in ritual and tribute, were a significant agricultural product in the Aztec world, grown extensively in places like the Chinampas. The demand was immense, especially in the capital city, for everything from daily offerings to elaborate festival decorations. Beyond the beauty and ritual, your Chinampa might also host a wealth of medicinal plants. The knowledge of herbs and their uses was incredibly sophisticated in Aztec society, passed down through generations. Your grandmother might know remedies for everything from a headache to a stomachache, and many of those key ingredients would be grown right here on your floating garden. You might cultivate plants like taloch, for pain relief, handle with extreme caution, obviously. Ancient medicine wasn't always gentle, or herbs for teas to aid digestion. Your Chinampa becomes a small personal pharmacy, ready to provide relief when illness strikes. Trying to explain the concept of a modern pharmacy, where everything comes in little plastic bottles, would probably just result in confused blinking. So you don't grow your fever reducer, you just buy it in a rock, This deep understanding of plant properties is a quirky or fringe tidbit to many modern people who often underestimate the botanical knowledge of ancient cultures. The Aztecs had names for hundreds, if not thousands, of plants and knew their specific properties: nutritional, medicinal, spiritual, or practical. They used plant parts for everything from dyes and soaps to poisons and hallucinogens, though hopefully not on your average Tuesday afternoon. Your plot contributes to this collective knowledge, perhaps growing a rare herb needed by the local healer. And it's not just plants. What about materials? The edges of your Chinampa and the surrounding waterways are likely thick with reeds and rushes. These aren't just decorative aquatic plants. They are incredibly useful. You harvest them to weave into mats, essential items for sleeping, sitting, or drying produce. You might use the thicker reeds for building small structures, like a tool shed or a small temporary shelter on your plot. They can be used for baskets for thatching roofs or even bundled together to reinforce the chinampa edges. It's the ultimate multi-purpose crop. You grow it in the water and it becomes the furniture and building materials for your life. It's like your garden also provides the IKEA catalog, but you have to assemble everything yourself. And the assembly instructions are just whispered legends. Historians still argue whether the production of non-food items like flowers, medicinal herbs, or reeds on chinampas was primarily dictated by individual farmer choice based on market demand, or if there was state or local community pressure to cultivate certain items, particularly those needed for tribute or public ceremonies. Did the local Kalpuli head nudge you towards growing more marigolds for the upcoming festival? Or did you simply see that people in the city were paying good prices for high-quality medicinal plants? It was likely a blend of both, with farmers responding to market signals but also potentially fulfilling certain community obligations or contributing to temple needs. Think about the ecosystem you've created. It's not a monoculture. You have your staple food crops, yes, but interspersed among them, or in dedicated areas, are these other vital plants. The flowers attract pollinators, benefiting your food crops. The reeds provide habitat for birds and insects, contributing to the overall health of the system. The diversity of plant life helps prevent soil depletion and reduces the risk of widespread crop failure from a single pest or disease. It's an intentionally engineered biodiversity where every part plays a role. Imagine walking along the narrow pathways between plots. The air changes as you move from a section of tall maize stalks to an area dedicated to low-lying herbs and flowers. The sounds change too. Maybe the buzz of bees among the blossoms, the rustle of reeds in the breeze. The smells shift from the rich earth and growing greens to the perfumes of flowers or the pungent aroma of medicinal herbs. Your senses are constantly engaged by the variety of life you are cultivating. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that your work supports so many different aspects of life. You are feeding people, yes, but you are also contributing to the beauty of the world, the health of your community, and the practical necessities of daily existence. You are a food producer, a florist, a pharmacist, and a supplier of building materials, all from your small patch of mud and water. It's a testament to the ingenuity of the system and your own skill as a cultivator. Perhaps you have a small corner dedicated to growing specific plants needed for offerings at the local temple. Or maybe you specialize in a particular type of reed, known for its strength, selling it to weavers. This specialization adds another layer of complexity to the chinampa economy. Farmers weren't just interchangeable units. They had their own areas of expertise, their own market niches. You might trade your surplus of medicinal herbs for your neighbor's particularly fine maize, or sell your flowers to a merchant who will transport them into the city. This interconnectedness, both in terms of the ecosystem and the human community, is what makes the chinampa system so resilient and productive. It's not just about the fertile soil, it's about the smart use of space, the understanding of plant properties, the constant maintenance, and the ability to produce a diverse range of goods to meet the needs of a complex society. Your little floating garden is a microcosm of that complexity, a hub of productivity that goes far beyond simple sustenance. As the light begins to soften, casting long shadows across the water, you look at the mix of crops and flowers on your plot. You feel the quiet pride of a job well done, knowing you've contributed not just calories, but color-scent healing and comfort to the world around you. You've seen the incredible variety that bursts from your plot. Not just the food that fills bellies, but the flowers for ceremony, the herbs for healing, the reeds for building. It's a testament to the land, yes, but even more so, it's a testament to the people. You are not alone out here on the water. Life on the chinampas isn't just about your individual patch. It's deeply intertwined with your neighbors, with the wider community that lives and works in this watery landscape. Look around now as the day settles. The air is cooler perhaps, carrying the scent of cooking fires or the distant sound of voices from other plots. You see other figures hunched over their own gardens, poling canoes along the narrow canals or heading back towards the shore settlements. This isn't isolated labor. It's a shared existence, a network of families and individuals bound together by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of this unique agricultural system. Your closest neighbors are likely kin or members of your kapuli, The basic social unit in Aztec society often centered around a specific geographical area or lineage. The Chinampa districts were organized by these kapali. This means the people around you aren't just random strangers. They are your support system, your colleagues, your potential trading partners, and the folks you share the daily grind with. Need an extra pair of hands for dredging mud? Your neighbor might help, expecting you to return the favor when their maize needs harvesting. Did your canoe spring a leak? Someone nearby likely has the skills and materials to help patch it. This shared labor, known as tekio, wasn't just neighborly goodwill. It was often an organized part of community life. Certain large tasks like the initial construction of chinampas or the regular dredging of canals that benefited everyone might be undertaken communally. Imagine a group of men and women working together, poles digging into the muddy-bottom canoes laden with rich sediment, a rhythm developing as they coordinate their efforts. It's hard work, yes, but doing it alongside others with shared purpose, and maybe even some shared songs or stories, makes it a little less backbreaking. It's a far cry from ordering a skip bin and hoping the council collects it on time. Daily life revolves around the sun and the crops. Your morning starts early, often before dawn, heading out to your plot. You spend the day tending, weeding, planting, harvesting, hauling, but it's punctuated by interactions. You might pole your canoe to a nearby market area, perhaps on a larger chinampa, or a piece of dry land jutting into the water to trade your produce or buy what you need. You'll chat with other farmers, exchange gossip, discuss the weather, or complain about pests. Some things never change, do they? Your kids, if you have them, might play in the shallow water, learning to paddle canoes or fish while you work nearby. It's a whole way of life built around this agricultural space. A mainstream historical fact is that the Chinampa system required a significant amount of organized labor, both individual family work and community-level projects, to maintain the canals and the plots themselves. The sheer effort involved in constantly dredging sediment and rebuilding edges meant that this was not a low-maintenance form of farming. It demanded cooperation and a consistent workforce, which the Aztec social structure, particularly the Calpulli system, helped provide. Think of it like a really intense compulsory community garden program, but instead of growing kale for organic cafes, you're growing the staple food for a massive empire, and your garden floats. Beyond the labor, there's the social fabric. Marriages were arranged, children were born and raised, elders passed down knowledge, and festivals were celebrated within these communities. The Chinampa villages weren't just work camps, they were homes. You'd attend ceremonies at the local temple, participate in rituals tied to the agricultural cycle, and rely on your neighbors for help in times of need, whether it was illness, a damaged plot, or personal hardship. The close proximity of living and working fostered strong bonds. You literally shared the same water. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Chinampa life might be related to the ingenious ways they use the environment for more than just farming. For example, some accounts suggest that fishing and fowling in the canals and surrounding lake areas were significant supplementary activities for Chinampa residents. They weren't just farmers. They were also part-time fishermen and hunters, adding protein to their diet and another source of income or trade. The canals weren't just irrigation ditches. They were teeming with fish frogs and other aquatic life, providing a living larder just steps from their crops. Imagine your modern garden also coming equipped with a fully stocked pond. Pretty neat, right? This blend of farming, fishing, and other activities highlights the integrated nature of their relationship with the lake ecosystem. They manipulated it for agriculture, yes, but they also harvested its natural bounty. It wasn't just about taming nature. It was about working within it, understanding its cycles and resources. Historians still argue whether the social structure and communal labor arrangements of the Chinampa system were a key factor in its success and sustainability, or if the environmental advantages of the lake and the rich soil were the primary drivers. Was it the genius of the farming method itself or the robust social organization that made it possible to execute and maintain on such a massive scale? It's a classic chicken or egg scenario in historical analysis. Did the system shape the society, or did the society enable the system? Probably a bit of both, because history rarely gives you clean, simple answers, which is frankly annoying when you just want to get some sleep. Think about the knowledge transfer that happened here. How did you learn to build and maintain a Chinampa? From your parents, your grandparents, your neighbors. This wasn't taught in formal schools, it was learned through doing, through observation, through participating in the daily and seasonal tasks from a young age. The communal aspect meant that expertise was shared. An older farmer might advise a younger one on dealing with a particular pest or the best time to dredge a certain canal section. It was an apprenticeship system rooted in community. Evenings on the Chinampas would be different from the city. The sounds would be softer. The lapping of water, the calls of birds' distant voices, maybe music from a reed flute. You'd gather with family, perhaps sharing a simple meal, prepared with ingredients from your plot, telling stories, mending tools, or preparing for the next day's work. The lights would be few, perhaps, just the glow of small fires or torches leaving the vast expanse of the night sky overhead, reflected in the dark water. The interconnectedness extended beyond immediate neighbors. Chinampa produce was vital for feeding the massive population of Tenochtitlan. This meant you were part of a larger economic network. Merchants would come out to the Chinampa areas, or farmers would pull their canoes into the city markets, transporting fresh fruits, vegetables, flowers, and herbs. Your daily labor contributed directly to the sustenance and economy of the empire's heart. You were literally growing the food that fueled the city, which is a pretty significant role for a farmer. There's a sense of stability that comes with this rootedness in both the land and the community. Despite the physical demands, there's a predictable rhythm to life tied to the seasons and the needs of the crops. You know your place, you know your responsibilities, and you know you are part of something larger than yourself. Your family, your Kalpuli, the network of Chinampa farmers, and ultimately the empire that depends on your productivity. It creates a sense of belonging, a social safety net woven from shared labor and mutual dependence. Even if you had a bad harvest, your neighbors likely had a better one and would help you out. Try getting that kind of solidarity on LinkedIn. So you've built this incredible artificial island out of mud and reeds, surrounded by water, a testament to human ingenuity, and a truly astonishing amount of manual labor. Now what? Well, now you farm it. And farming a Chinampa wasn't quite like dropping seeds into a field and hoping for the best. This was intensive agriculture requiring constant attention, precise timing, and a deep understanding of your unique environment. The daily life of a Chinampa farmer was busy, muddy, and incredibly productive. Imagine you wake up with the sun just beginning to cast long shadows across the lake. You grab your simple tools, maybe a koe, a kind of foot plow used for turning the soil, and a planting stick. You hop in your canoe moored right outside your dwelling, or perhaps in a small harbor area serving your section of Chinampas, and paddle out onto the calm water of the canal that separates your home from your floating field. The air is cool and humid, smelling of earth and water. When you arrive at your Chinampa, the first thing you notice is the soil. Remember that rich black muck. It's perfect, constantly nourished by the water table just below its surface. It's always moist and packed with nutrients. This is prime real estate for plants. Because the soil is so fertile and the climate in the Valley of Mexico is generally favorable, you're not limited to one growing season. You're thinking multiple harvests back to back all year round. What are you growing? The staples, of course. Maize corn is absolutely central, the backbone of the Mesoamerican diet. But you're also cultivating beans, which often grow up the corn. Stalks, a clever bit of companion planting that provides nitrogen to the soil. Squash is another must-have, its broad leaves, helping to shade the soil and conserve moisture. You might also be growing chili peppers for spiced tomatoes, though they were smaller and less varied than today's amaranth for grain, and greens and a variety of other vegetables and herbs. Flowers are important too, not just for beauty or offerings, but some were edible or medicinal. The process of planting is meticulous. Because you're aiming for maximum productivity, you often start seedlings in nurseries. Before the space on the Chinampa is even free, you'd create small seed beds, maybe on a corner of the Chinampa itself, or perhaps in trays. A quirky tidbit here, they often use small squares cut from the muddy soil itself as individual pots for seedlings. Imagine little cubes of lakebed mud, each holding a precious young plant waiting to be transplanted. It's like nature's own seed starting kit. When a section of your Chinampa is ready, perhaps you've just harvested the previous crop. You'd prepare the soil. Using your COOS, you'd turn over the top layer, incorporating any remaining plant matter back into the soil. Then often using that same tool or just your hands, you'd level the surface. If needed, you might scoop a bit more fresh muck from the canal to replenish the nutrients. Now for the main event transplanting, you'd carefully transfer the sturdy seedlings from the nursery beds or mud cubes onto the prepared Chinampa surface. This allowed you to get a head start on the next crop, minimizing the downtime between harvests. You're not waiting for seeds to germinate in the main field. You're putting established young plants straight in. This is a form of intensive, accelerated agriculture. You'd plant in neat rows, maximizing the use of space, knowing exactly how many plants you could fit on your rectangular plot. It's an organized, almost industrial approach to farming centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Watering is less of a chore than it might be in a dry field. The Chinampa soil, remember, is constantly drawing moisture from the surrounding lake via capillary action. It's like having a self-watering garden bed. However, you might still need to supplement, especially during dry spells or for certain crops. Accessing water is as simple as dipping a pot or a bucket into the canal right beside your field. No need for long treks to a well or complex irrigation system spanning miles. The water is right there. But farming here isn't just about planting and waiting. It's about constant active care. You're weeding, pulling out any competing plants that dare to sprout in your fertile soil. You're monitoring for pests and diseases. You're maybe building small fences or using deterrents to keep birds or other animals from eating your precious crops. You're also managing the water level in the surrounding canals, which can be done communally by adjusting sluice gates or dikes. Although the extent of large-scale water control managed purely for Chinampa irrigation is something historians still argue whether it was as sophisticated and centralized as some accounts suggest, or if it was primarily managed at a local community level. Regardless, the constant availability of water in the canals was key. Then there's the ongoing replenishment of the soil. As your crops grow and are harvested, they draw nutrients from the mud. To maintain that incredible fertility and support 7 or 8 harvests a year, you need to keep adding that nutrient-rich muck. So regularly, perhaps every few months or even more frequently in some areas, you're back in your canoe scooping mud from the bottom of the canals and spreading it thinly but evenly over the surface of your Chinampa. This isn't just maintenance. It's essential refertilization, a continuous cycle of taking from the lake bed to give back to the artificial island. This constant interaction with the water and the mud means the life of a Chinampa farmer is deeply intertwined with the lake. You're working with wet soil surrounded by water, using canoes as your primary mode of transport. It's physically demanding work. Scooping heavy wet mud, bending over to plant and weed, paddling your canoe loaded with produce. But it's also incredibly rewarding. A mainstream historical fact, Chinampas were so productive that they could support a much higher population density than traditional farming, providing the caloric surplus necessary for Tenochtitlan to grow into the massive city it became. You, the farmer, were directly contributing to the strength and size of the empire. You were, in a very real sense, feeding the heart of the Aztec world. The crops grow quickly in these ideal conditions. Maize stalks shoot up, beans twine, squash vines spread. You harvest your crops by hand, gathering the ears of corn, picking beans, squash, and peppers. The harvest is a continuous process as different crops ripen at different times, and you're constantly preparing sections of your Chinampa for the next planting. Once harvested, you load your canoe with the bounty. Piles of fresh produce, vibrant colors against the dark wood of the boat and the green of the remaining plants. You paddle back along the canals, joining a quiet procession of other canoes laden with food, all heading towards the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan. Think about the rhythm of this life. It's dictated by the growth cycles of plants, the need for constant care, and the movement of the sun across the sky. There's a sense of continuity, of never really stopping. As one crop is being harvested, the next is already growing in the nursery beds, ready to take its place. You're always planting, always tending, always harvesting, always replenishing. It's a sophisticated system relying on generational knowledge passed down about which crops to plant, when, how to manage the soil, and how to work with the lake. It's farming, yes, but it's also being a gardener, an engineer, and a steward of this unique, created landscape. It's a life built on mud, water, and the quiet, persistent labor of turning sunlight and nutrients into food for an empire. So, you've harvested your bountiful Chinampa. Your canoe is low in the water, laden with ears of golden corn, vibrant green squash, fiery red chilies, and perhaps bundles of fragrant herbs and flowers. This isn't just food for your family. This is sustenance for a city, a massive, thriving urban center that relies almost entirely on the incredible productivity of these floating fields. You push off from the edge of your chinampa, easing your canoe into the tranquil water of the canal. You're not alone. All around you, other farmers are doing the same. Their canoes piled high with the day's harvest. It creates a kind of gentle, watery rush hour, a silent procession of production heading towards the heart of the Aztec world. The canals, remember, weren't just boundaries for the chinampas. They were the highways, the essential transportation network that connected the agricultural zones to the consumer hub. Imagine instead of bumper-to-bumper traffic, you have canoe-to-canoe gentle nudging everyone just trying to get their kale, or amaranth in this case, to market before the best spots are taken. Your destination is Tenochtitlan itself, or specifically its incredible marketplaces. The most famous and one of the largest in the world at the time was the market at Tlatelolco, a city that was originally separate but later incorporated into the expanding Aztec capital. Think of it as the ultimate farmer's market, but on a scale that would make your local weekend craft fair look like a single lemonade stand. It was said to host tens of thousands of people daily, perhaps even more on major market days, trading not just food, but everything imaginable. Textiles, pottery tools, jewelry, obsidian blades, even slaves and exotic animals. But the lifeblood flowing into the market, the absolute core of the trade, was food, and a huge portion of that came from the chinampas. Paddling closer to the city, the canals become busier, merging with channels carrying goods from other parts of the empire. But the fresh produce canoes from the chinampa districts are instantly recognizable. You glide past the impressive stone buildings of the city, maybe catching a glimpse of the towering Templo Mayor in the distance. The sounds of the city begin to reach you, the murmur of voices, the calls of vendors, the distant rhythm of drums. It's a vibrant, energetic place fueled by the quiet labor you and your fellow farmers perform on the water. As you arrive at the market area along the canals, there are designated docks or sections where the food producers unload their goods. The organization is surprisingly sophisticated. There were specific areas for different types of produce, creating a visually stunning display of agricultural abundance. Piles of golden maize ears, baskets overflowing with red tomatoes and green peppers, mounds of squash, bundles of beans, fragrant herbs and vibrant flowers. It was a feast for the eyes as much as it was sustenance for the stomach. You unload your canoe, perhaps setting up your display on a mat on the ground or on a low platform. Buyers ranging from individual city dwellers doing their daily shopping to merchants buying in bulk for resale or for the emperor's palace circulate constantly. You haggle over prices measured in cacao beans, yes, chocolate was currency, or perhaps through barter with other goods. It's a direct connection between producer and consumer, facilitated by this incredible watery transport system. The sheer volume of food needed to feed a city estimated to have hundreds of thousands of inhabitants was staggering. A mainstream historical fact here. Some estimates put the population of Tenochtitlan and its immediate surroundings at its peak at over 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world in the early 16th century. To support that many people without wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden for transport, you needed incredibly efficient, high-yield agriculture located very close to the city center, and you needed a transport system that could handle the volume. The chinampas, right there in the lake surrounding the city connected by canals, provided exactly that. Their intensive year-round production meant a constant, reliable flow of food into the markets. This surplus food production was crucial for the growth and complexity of Aztec society. When not everyone has to farm just to survive, people are freed up to do other things. This surplus allowed for specialization. You had priests, warriors, artisans, merchants, scribes, builders, all the different roles that make up a complex urban civilization. They could focus on their trades because they knew the farmers on the chinampas were feeding them. It's the foundation upon which the entire magnificent, albeit slightly terrifying structure of the Aztec Empire was built. A quirky tidbit about these markets: alongside the familiar fruits and vegetables from your chinampa, you might see vendors selling less common items, perhaps protein sources like lake insects or even dogs specifically bred for food. The diversity of goods was immense, reflecting both the empire's reach and the local environment's offerings. It wasn't just a grocery store, it was a window into the entire Aztec world economy and diet. Of course, managing the flow of goods and the bustling markets wasn't pure chaos. There was a system. Officials oversaw the market, ensuring fair trade, settling disputes, and collecting taxes. This level of organization was necessary to keep such a massive economic engine running smoothly. Historians still argue whether the market administration was primarily run by appointed officials from the state, or if there was a stronger element of merchant class, self-governance, and regulation. Either way, it worked well enough to handle the immense daily volume of trade. The impact of the chinampas extended beyond just calories. The variety of crops you grew provided a diverse and nutritious diet, contributing to the health and vitality of the population. The flowers you cultivated were used for offerings, decoration, and ceremony, woven into the fabric of religious and social life. The entire system was a testament to the Aztecs' ability to not just survive, but to thrive and build a powerful empire in a challenging environment, all thanks to their ingenuity in creating and working with these artificial islands. You, the farmer paddling your canoe, were literally feeding an empire, providing the energy and resources that allowed the priests to conduct their rituals, the warriors to expand the territory, and the builders to raise pyramids. It was a direct visible contribution measured in baskets of corn and bundles of beans. So you spend your day at the market trading your hard-earned produce for other necessities, or perhaps for luxuries. As the sun begins to set, casting a warm glow over the city, you load up your canoe with whatever you've acquired and join the reverse flow of traffic, paddling back towards the quieter Chinampa districts. You leave the bustling market, the smells and sounds fading behind you, returning to the rhythmic life of the floating fields. The cycle is complete for the day, but tomorrow the plants will have grown a little more, and the work and the feeding of the city will continue. Word count 1146. You paddle back from the market, the sounds of the city fading behind you as you glide through the quieter channels. The rhythm of the water, the gentle dip of your paddle, the soft rustling of leaves on the bank. It's a calming contrast to the bustling energy of Tlatelolco. You've done your part today, contributing to the vast network that sustains the great city. You tie up your canoe step onto the familiar firm ground of your Chinampa, and the day draws to a close. Life here on these watery fields feels eternal, connected to the cycles of planting, growth, and harvest that have repeated for generations. But history, as you know, rarely allows anything to remain unchanged forever. The world outside these tranquil canals was shifting, and soon a storm unlike any the Aztec Empire had ever faced would arrive, dramatically altering the landscape, the city, and the fate of these incredible floating gardens. You might have heard whispers in the market, strange tales of pale-skinned people arriving from the east, riding enormous beasts and wielding fire-spitting sticks. At first they were distant rumors, perhaps dismissed as fanciful stories, but those rumors would soon become a terrifying reality. The arrival of Hernan Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors, along with their indigenous allies who harbored their own grievances against the Aztec Empire, marked the beginning of the end for the world you knew. The conflict that followed was brutal and devastating. Tenochtitlan, the magnificent city built on the lake, became the primary target. The lake itself, which had been the source of life and connection for the Chinampas, was turned into a battlefield. The Spanish, lacking naval power, built brigantines on the shores and launched them onto the lake, giving them control of the waterways. This control had an immediate and catastrophic impact on the Chinampas. Remember how essential the canals were for transport. With Spanish ships patrolling the waters, moving produce to the city became incredibly dangerous, if not impossible, during the siege. Your livelihood, directly tied to feeding the city, was choked off. The very system designed to provide sustenance now became a target, or was simply cut off from its purpose. The resilience of the Chinampa system, its ability to produce food even under difficult conditions, was immense, but it couldn't withstand war being waged directly upon its watery surface and supply lines. During the brutal siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the lake was a central arena of conflict. The Spanish and their allies used their ships to attack the city's defenses, blockade supply routes, which included the Chinampa canals and ferry troops. The fighting would have come right through the channels you navigated daily, turning peaceful routes into deadly corridors. Some Chinampas were likely damaged or abandoned, As the conflict raged, the careful balance of earth and water disrupted by the chaos of war. It's hard to cultivate beans when arrows and cannonballs are flying over your head. After the city finally felt devastated by warfare, disease, and starvation, the world was irrevocably changed. The Spanish took control, and their priorities were very different from those of the Aztec rulers. While they recognized the fertility of the Chinampas, their long-term vision involved draining the lake, seeing it as a source of flooding and an obstacle to European-style urban development and land ownership. This began a centuries-long process of hydraulic engineering aimed at removing the water which directly undermined the Chinampa system. The Chinampas relied on the high water table and the surrounding canals for their moisture and structure. As the lake was drained, many Chinampas dried out, became part of the solid ground, and lost their unique characteristics and intensive productivity. A mainstream historical fact about this period: the Spanish conquest led to a massive demographic collapse among the indigenous population due to disease warfare and the disruption of traditional ways of life. This population decline meant there were fewer people to work the Chinampas and less demand for the food they produced, further contributing to the system's decline in many areas. It's a grim reminder that the most efficient agricultural system in the world can't thrive without people to tend it and a market to consume its bounty. The Spanish also introduced new crops and agricultural techniques like the plow and draft animals, though animals weren't well suited to the soft Chinampa soil. Land ownership patterns shifted dramatically, with large estates, haciendas, replacing the communal or calpulli-based land tenure system of the Aztecs. While some indigenous communities managed to retain their Chinampas, especially in areas further from the immediate center of Spanish power, the system as a whole contracted significantly, a quirky tidbit from the post-conquest era. Even as the lake was being drained, some Spanish administrators and observers were quite impressed by the Chinampas and noted their incredible productivity. There were even attempts by some to understand and replicate the system, recognizing its efficiency, though these efforts often didn't fully grasp the intricate ecological knowledge and community cooperation required to maintain it. It's like trying to replicate a sourdough starter without understanding yeast. You get bread, but it's not the same. Historians still argue whether the primary cause for the decline of the Chinampa system after the conquest was the direct impact of warfare and disease, or the long-term effects of Spanish hydraulic policies and changes in land use and economy. It was likely a combination of all these factors, creating a perfect storm that gradually eroded the foundations of the watery fields. However, the Chinampas didn't vanish entirely. In some southern areas of the former lake system, particularly around what is now Xochimilco, the practice persisted. Here, communities continued to cultivate the floating gardens, adapting to the changing environment as the lake shrank. Today, these surviving Chinampas are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a living testament to the ingenuity of Aztec agriculture. You can still visit Xochimilco aboard a colorful boat called a trajinera and glide through canals much like the ones you navigated centuries ago, seeing some of these ancient fields still being worked, growing vegetables, flowers, and even plants for nurseries. So while the vast network that fed the mighty Tenochtitlan largely disappeared under concrete and fill as Mexico City grew, the fundamental principles and even some of the physical structures endured. The knowledge wasn't entirely lost, passed down through generations in those areas where the Chinampas survived. Your patient work building layers of mud and reeds, navigating the canals, nurturing the plants. It wasn't just a fleeting moment in time. It was part of a remarkable human achievement, an innovative way to live and thrive in a challenging environment, a legacy that literally shaped the landscape and fed an empire. Even if the empire fell, the cleverness of the garden endured, stubborn and resilient like the reeds themselves, pushing through the water's surface. And perhaps, just perhaps, there are lessons for us even now in the mud and the patience of the ancient Aztec gardener. Word counting 11:38, awaiting continue. Wind down begins here. And now, as the sun has set on our journey back through the watery world of the Aztec Chinampas, you can feel the stillness settling in. The paddle is quiet in your hand. The gentle lapping of the water against the sides of the canoe fades into a soft whisper. The smells of the market are long gone, replaced by the cool, earthy scent of the water and the plants around you. Your muscles might feel the pleasant fatigue of a day spent working the soil and navigating the canals. Let that feeling wash over you, a connection to the ancient rhythm of labor and reward. The great city with its towering temples and bustling markets seems distant now, a dream fading with the twilight. Here on the Shinampa, it is just you, the dark water, and the fertile earth cradling the sleeping plants. The worries of the day, like ripples in the canal, smooth themselves out into calm. There's nothing more to do, nowhere else to paddle. The work is done for today. The history has unfolded, taking us from the murky origins to the vibrant peak and the eventual fading of this remarkable system. It's a story of human cleverness, adapting to the world around them, creating abundance from what seemed like an obstacle. Let the images of the floating gardens, the busy canals, and the silent, patient work drift softly in your mind. They are part of the quiet hum of history, a lullaby from the past. Just breathe gently now. Feel the support beneath you, the stillness around you. The water is calm, the night is quiet. There are no more stories to tell tonight, only rest. Let your thoughts float away like a small reed raft, drifting slowly on the surface of a peaceful lake. You are safe, you are still, and it is time to sleep. Sweet dreams.